Hello, and welcome to Apparitions and Alibis. I am your host, AJ Stallman, and this is episode 11. Australia? Wow. South Africa? Wow. I'm so happy this podcast is reaching places I've never even dreamed of. Thank you so much to all of you listeners. You really make my little heart thump. Today's story involves a fair maiden wronged by an evil man and saved by a hero. Well, kinda. Have you ever thought about making your own podcast? Is there something that the podcast world is just missing that you want to put in it? Well, do what I did and download Anchor. If you haven't heard of it, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's totally free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast, and it's all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Robert Schultz was a nationally renowned scientist in the field of biometrics and DNA research. He was a founding member of the Virginia Biotechnology Association. He was also a father of 3 children, Michelle, Jesse, and Clara. When Clara was 10, her mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Just as many families, it was a difficult time. Surviving longer than expected, the mother passed away when Clara was 14. Clara was a shy and quiet individual who didn't seem to have many friends in school. To help, Clara focused on something other than her mother's death. Robert bought her a horse. She enjoyed riding and spending time with her new equine friend. But many teens go through an angsty phase, and Clara was no different. She dressed in all black and listened to Marilyn Manson. She also enjoyed playing fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Her older siblings, Michelle and Jesse, were both very outgoing like their father and fairly popular. Some who were interviewed stated that with her siblings being so opposite, she was probably harder on herself and turned inward even more. During her time at her local high school in Leesburg, Virginia, she wasn't completely alone. She did make friends with a couple of the other quiet outsiders in the school. Catherine Inglis and Michael Falf, Catherine's boyfriend, who had similar interests, such as D&D. However, Clara would craft her own live-action role-playing game called The Underworld, where she reigned over all. She was named Lord Chaos. Robert didn't mind her dark creativity and was glad she found something that she was interested in. Eventually, she graduated high school and began furthering her education at James Madison University. Perhaps this made her feel like she had something she was in control of. Her non-fantasy life wasn't going the best at the time. Her grades were suffering, and Robert was upset. Him having a PhD, we can conclude that education was very prized in the Schwartz family. Clara seemed over college and immersed herself in the underworld. Instead of studying, she spent time recruiting players on the college campus. One new player that would join was Patrick House. He joined June 2001. He was an interesting character who firmly believed that dragons once walked the earth and were real, that they existed during King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Clara and Patrick dated for a short time, roughly until September of 2001, but her eye fell on a new player, Kyle Hulbert. He too seemed to be living in a fantasy world. He enjoyed vampires and a dark lifestyle as well. He had been a ward of the state since age 6 and had spent a lot of his childhood bouncing around from home to home and being in and out of mental facilities. At some point in his adolescence, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. At age 18, he's released from state custody. Once released, he drifted around, basically homeless. The closest he had achieved to a home was through the kindness of a friend named Sean Boomhall and his father, allowing him to stay there with them. According to the friend and family, he was harmless, and he liked to clean around the house. The Boomhall family attempted to help Robert get a job, but with his history of being in a mental institution, many places were not too interested in hiring him. With his days empty, he spent many hours playing D&D and fiddling with his small hobby, knives. Sean stated in an interview with Snapped that Kyle enjoyed knives and spent time playing with them and attempting to throw them. At the end of September at a local Renaissance fair is when Clara and Kyle first met. Clara was at the fair with her friends Catherine and Michael and quickly introduced Kyle to the group. When introducing him, she stated that Kyle was an assassin. They all hit it off, and Kyle and Michael became very close. With all similar interests, the group of friends began a bond. In November, Catherine, Michael, and Kyle went to JMU to spend the weekend with Clara. While Clara and Kyle deemed themselves just friends, they seemed to be close enough that Clara was willing and able and bought Kyle a sword. After receiving the gift, Kyle carried it with him for a number of weeks. Soon, it was Thanksgiving break, and Kyle went with Clara to meet her father. Though it wasn't your typical first introduction. He camped out in the woods the night before they arrived. The next morning, Clara introduced him to Robert. After the holiday weekend was over, Clara returned to JMU and Kyle returned to Dungeons & Dragons. He also began practicing assassin moves with his new sword. Boomhall's father saw him practicing one day and asked if he could see the sword. And taking a closer look, he saw that the edge of the sword was not sharp. The father, being an avid hunter, he shook his head and took it upon himself to sharpen it. He stated in an interview with Snapped that over a few days he got it sharpened almost to the point of the sharpness of a ninja sword. December 10th, 2001, Robert didn't turn up for work. He had an important meeting at 1 p.m., and he wasn't the type to miss work, let alone not call. His work called Brad Hager, Robert's friend, and asked him to check up on Robert. Unfortunately, Brad was at work and roughly 40 minutes away, so instead he offered to call a neighbor, Samuel, to check on Robert. When Samuel Welsh finally made it to the stone and log house tucked back deep into the woods, he found Robert Schultz face down in the kitchen. He lay dead, covered in stab wounds in front of his kitchen sink. Samuel immediately closed the door and went to his car, calling police. It had rained that past Saturday, and the first road to get to the home was nothing but mud. The mud and the sheer distance from the police station to the remote home made it to where it took law enforcement quite a while to make it to the crime scene. At the scene, there were no clues as to who the killer was, nor motives behind the violent crime. Nothing was missing. There were no fingerprints or hairs found. There did appear to have been a struggle when it was noticed that the furniture had been moved around. It was obvious that Robert tried to get away, but the attacker stabbed him multiple times. And even at the crime scene, it was evident that the killer kept stabbing Robert once he collapsed on the kitchen floor. The murder was so hate-fueled that some of the knife's marks went all the way through Clara's father and into the wooden floor that lay beneath him. While crime scene investigators finished processing the scene, police notified Robert Schultz, next of kin, his 3 children. His son Jesse lived in North Carolina, but both daughters went to school at Harrisonburg, Virginia. The police made their way to JMU to notify the girls. The oldest daughter, Michelle, was very distraught and took the news very hard. Clara, on the other hand, reacted much differently than her sister. She seemed robotic. There was no crying, there was no emotion whatsoever. The only thing she said to investigators was, "How?" Police were having a hard time gathering any information on what might have happened to the scientist. They began canvassing the area around the Schwartz home with no other idea what to do. It was a long shot, but it was a long shot that got them the break they needed. When asking around to neighbors if they had seen anything out of the ordinary, one neighbor did. A young man had knocked on her door around 7 p.m. on Saturday night. Only 48 hours later, Robert Schultz would be found dead. The young man said his name was Kyle Hulbert and that his car had gotten stuck in the mud. He asked politely to use their phone. They offered him a cup of tea, and together they called a tow truck. After the call, Kyle left, walking his way into the darkness. After calling the tow company, the police were able to track down Kyle Hulbert. They were able to find the car at the tow lot, but upon inspection, the car was not Kyle's, but rather registered to Michael Fall, Kyle and Clara's friend. When police spoke to the person who towed the car, he said that there had been 3 people waiting when he came to pull the car out: Kyle, Michael, and Michael's girlfriend, Catherine. The next day, December 11th, the police picked up Michael and Catherine at Michael's parents' house in Manassas. They also went to bring in Kyle for all 3 to be questioned, but they quickly found out that he was in Maryland, staying with a friend. While waiting for Maryland police to assist them, the local authorities searched Michael's parents' house for anything related to the murder. In the basement where Michael and Catherine lived, they found Kyle's samurai sword. It had been washed and it was still wet when removed from its covering. Once spoken to at the station, the couple was very cooperative. They stated that the weekend Kyle had stayed with them, and on Saturday they asked him for a ride. He asked them for a ride. Sorry. Apparently, he told them he had a job to do. What they took it to mean was that he was to assassinate someone, you know, because he's an assassin. Michael and Catherine agreed to follow Kyle's plan. The Snapped episode kept calling their mental state basically being taken over by a goth fantasy, and I just want to put on record that I do not believe D&D is goth. Just because you play D&D or any RPG does not make you a goth nor mentally unstable. I hope people aren't being bigots and closed-minded when it comes to this topic, and I love D&D. That is all. However, I do agree that these kids were fully immersed in the fantasy, and Kyle probably had a hard time telling the difference because of his disorder. He probably had a hard time telling the difference between the real world and the fantasy one that Clara and the others had created. But according to Catherine and Michael, they dropped Kyle off a few hundred yards from the Schwartz home, knowing he had a sword on him. They estimated that Kyle had only been gone 30 minutes before he returned to the car. In the interrogation room, Michael made it very clear he wasn't aware of how much trouble he and his friends were in. He called the whole situation a big oopsie. Since Michael and Catherine cooperated, they did not arrest the couple that night, and instead, they focused on getting Kyle from Maryland. Teaming up with Maryland police, they commenced a felony takedown to retrieve Kyle. For those who don't know, a felony takedown is when they surround you and yell at you to get on the ground, put your hands on your head, put your hands above your head, just all of the hooting and hollering. Once in custody, Kyle did not resist, and he didn't deny killing the scientist and father of 3. Kyle did, however, state that the murder was justified. He saw himself as a protector and hero for the action. He told them that Mr. Schwartz had been abusing his youngest daughter. When asked to recount the night of the murder, he agreed with everything Michael and Catherine had stated, adding to it what happened when he was alone, going to the house. He had hid the 2-foot sword on his back under his jackets. When Robert Schultz opened the door, Kyle attacked, stabbing him multiple times. Kyle referenced going into a vampire-like frenzy once he tasted blood. That evening, Kyle was booked on murder charges. Michael and Catherine were arrested the next day and charged with murder also. But was the whole plan just Kyle's? Or was someone else involved? After all, according to Kyle, once the murder occurred, he called Clara and let her know that the job was done. Whenever the police went to speak with Clara at the college, she either wasn't there or wasn't available. It wasn't until December 20th that they were able to talk to her, immediately after her father's funeral. Once at the station, Clara said that Michael and Kyle did call her and told her what they had done that bloody Saturday. She also said that she didn't believe them and had blown the whole thing off. She did agree with something that Kyle stated, though, that her father and her did not have the best relationship. She felt that her father hated her because he wanted her to be like her more popular sister, Michelle, and she was just the opposite. She also stated that she was failing to live up to his expectations in school as well, as she wasn't performing well, and that if he was ever displeased, he made sure that she knew. According to the JMU student, he was verbally and sometimes even physically abusive. This is information she had told Kyle, but she denied asking Kyle to assassinate her father. Though she did say Kyle had brought up the idea on several occasions. She felt as though Kyle was someone who was all talk and no action, and if she had thought her father was in any real danger, she would have called campus police. At the end of the interrogation, the investigators let her go home. At the time, they couldn't say if she was or was not a co-conspirator. By February 1st, almost 2 months later, investigators made another trip to Clara's college. This time, they brought a search warrant, giving them permission to seize the computer in Clara's dorm room. However, when law enforcement got their hands on her computer, they knew it would be much easier to get the information they needed than what they had originally thought. Clara had saved all instant message conversations with all of her friends. The information from the conversations she had with Kyle was shrouded with information. Clara was in fact involved and was the organizer of her father's murder. That afternoon, the girl would be arrested for the killing of Robert Schultz. She was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Friends and family were stunned by Clara's arrest. They assumed that the investigators got it all wrong. October 7, 2002, Clara Schwartz walked into court to go to trial for her father's murder. Michael Fall and Kyle Hubert were also in jail waiting trials for murder charges. But Catherine Ingalls was out on bail and had a deal with the prosecution. She pled guilty to accessory after the fact. As part of the deal, Catherine had agreed to testify. Prosecution also had another witness against Clara, her former boyfriend, Patrick House. They had met because of the common love for role-playing games, but how they met is not as important as why they broke up. She wanted him to kill her father. At first, Patrick didn't think her request was real. He thought it was just part of the game and went along with it. But according to Patrick, he eventually realized that Clara wasn't kidding and really wanted her father dead. Apparently, Clara had thrown some numbers around, talking of selling the farm and all the money they would gain from it. Clara gave Patrick a book about poisons and said that maybe that was a way he could get rid of her dad. It would be much harder to trace. Patrick stated he quickly broke things off with Clara, and soon after, Kyle came into the picture. With Kyle shiny and new, Clara seemed more than happy to let Patrick go. As soon as Patrick was done on the stand, the prosecution called up Kyle. Kyle pled the fifth. Michael Fall also did not testify. But per her agreement, Catherine did. She was able to provide information into the relationship between Clara and Kyle. Clara's computer had also given police a look into their relationship. But Clara would type things such as, "I don't want to discuss it here on the computer. We'll talk later." Catherine would later say that the discussion would be the reason Michael, Catherine, and Kyle went to Harrisonburg to stay the weekend with Clara. But what about visiting Thanksgiving weekend? Well, Kyle thought it would be a good idea to meet his victim and also try to get a lay of the land and know his surroundings. And on December 4th, Clara had even sent Kyle a check to cover his expenses. The $60 would go to gloves to cover fingerprints and a bandana to cover his face. Also brought to the stand to clear up the abuse allegations was Clara's older sister, Michelle. She stated Robert was a good father who was just doing the best he could with Clara. Then the defense brought something that was completely unexpected. On Robert's computer was child pornography. Many of the images appeared to favor Clara. Prosecutors said that it looked suspicious, being as the images were downloaded onto the computer only about a week before the murder happened. With the computer not being password protected, anyone could have gone on and downloaded those images. On October 14th, the jury gave the verdict of guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of solicitation of murder, one for Kyle and one for Patrick House. Clara showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She wasn't surprised. On February in 2003, Clara Schwartz would be sentenced to 48 years in prison. In 2003, Kyle Hulbert pled guilty to first-degree murder. He is currently serving life in prison. Michael Fall pled guilty to second-degree murder and received an 18-year sentence. So the hero tries to help the poor lady and they all go to jail. Can you imagine how the siblings of Clara feel to know your own flesh and blood had your father killed? It's messed up on so many levels. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Instagram at Instagram. Follow us on Instagram at Apparitions and Alibis, or email us at apparitionsanalibis@gmail.com. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are, and I will talk to you later. Bye.